able-bodied men leaving for the front, Paris is left defenseless, its jails bursting with political prisoners. An unsettling fear floods the city. The growing mass of prisoners may be impossible to contain. Marat puts out a bloodthirsty call for revolutionary citizens to descend upon the prisons and slaughter all inside.
The foreign armies were advancing on Paris. Had they linked up in Paris with these bitter enemies of the revolutions in the prisons, of course, then the results would have been fairly horrific from the standpoint of the people.
In the first week of September, disastrous news arrives from the front. Prussia has taken Verdun, a town on the road to Paris. The enemy is now just miles away. The fear gripping Paris explodes. The sans-culottes break into the prisons and unleash a furious assault on the city's inmates. They will leave no traitor alive.
And the sans-culottes went to the prisons, particularly the prisons where refractory priests were being held, where nobles were being held, where political prisoners were being held, and they started carrying out their own impromptu trials that were very short and that very often simply ended with slaughter.
Women are raped and brutalized, priests disemboweled, aristocrats hacked to pieces. In a primeval slaughter, more than 1,600 are left dead in a matter of days. When word of the September massacres spreads throughout Europe, enemies of the revolution are sickened. Across the English Channel, the London Times gives voice to the revulsion.
Are these the rights of man? Is this the liberty of human nature? The most savage, four-footed tyrants that range unexplored Africa rise superior to these two-legged Parisian animals.
The revolution has taken an inalterable turn. Even Robespierre understands that things have gone too far, that the people cannot manage the revolution on their own. They need guidance, an iron hand. And with the power of his words, the incorruptible rises to the forefront as the man who will guide the revolution. Robespierre had once pushed for a constitutional monarchy. Now he believes there is no longer room for the king. A momentous decision is made. France will put its own king on trial. With the verdict a foregone conclusion, the only debate left is punishment. The moderates, the Girondins, called for sparing Louis's life, which isolates them in the convention.
The Girondins really crystallized as a faction in the convention over the debate over the king, because while they certainly wanted a republic, they were less sure that the king should actually have to die.
But the Girondins are outnumbered by the Jacobin call for blood.
Why did the Jacobins want to kill the king? I think they wanted to kill the king because, as Robespierre brilliantly said, you have to kill the king so the revolution can live. If the king is right, then the revolution is wrong.
In any system there had ever been, there's only one penalty for treason, and that is death. So in this sense, if the king is guilty of betraying the country in a time of war, then the argument is that he must suffer the death of a traitor.
On January 20th, 1793, Louis XVI is declared guilty. The sentence is read. The king must die. That evening, Louis is briefly reunited with his family. Calm in the face of their tears, he promises to return the next morning to say a final goodbye. He will not. He cannot bear his family's anguish and must not weaken away to the guillotine. The next morning, a closed carriage brings Louis to the scaffold. And he stoically makes his way to the blade. attempts to give a speech.
I trust that my death will be for the happiness of my people, but I grieve for France, and I fear that she may suffer the anger of the Lord.
But the guards drown him out with a drum roll. At 10:22 a.m., the man who once was king is no more. In the temple prison, Marie hears the cannons fire, heralding the death of her husband. She collapses in despair. The king's blood is spilled, the revolutionaries victorious. But the enemies of the revolution will soon claim a victory of their own. Their target? The man who is calling for so many heads to roll, Jean-Paul Marat. The execution of Louis XVI marks ultimate victory for the revolutionaries. A pivotal moment when a young nation, the French Republic, is literally born in blood. By the end of 1792, the radical Jacobins, believing the young revolution is in danger of being sabotaged by traitors, are steering the revolution with more and more violent means. But the Girondins, representing the people of the French countryside, want to slow the ascending violence for fear it will lead to civil war. Their most vocal opponent, Jean-Paul Marat, strikes back at the Girondins with furious tirades in his newspaper, naming those he believes are plotting against the revolution. Marat, who once called for the execution of 200, now demands 200,000 heads fall.
When you look at Marat's journalism, it's got one basic principle, which is be more extreme than anybody else and call for people to be killed. If you look at Marat's journalism all the time, he's saying, if only we chopped off a few heads, then things will be all right. And when things aren't all right, if only chop off a few more heads, things will be all right. Suddenly, people in Paris begin to massacre people, and Marat is the first to claim credit for that.
But the radical movement hasn't taken hold everywhere. People outside of Paris are furious at the spiraling brutality of the Jacobins and call for an end to the bloodletting. And the message reaches the lovely Charlotte Corday, an unassuming yet determined young woman from the provinces.
Charlotte Corday is an average person in the city of Caen. She's appalled by the killing that's going on there, and she, perhaps rightly, considers Marat one of the chief authors of that. He's been instrumental on the radical side of the revolution. His Ami du Peuple is still calling for heads.
July 13th, 1793. Charlotte Corday arrives in Paris. She knows that the friend of the people has an open-door policy at his home, where he can be found at nearly any hour soaking in his medicinal bath. Corday comes on the pretense that she carries a list of traitors, those collaborating with foreign armies to put an end to the revolution. Marat asks for the list, promising Corday that the traitors will be guillotined the next day.
Having given him that, she then produces a poignard, a little stiletto, and stabs him in the chest.
The so-called friend of the people dies instantly. The angry voice of his newspaper silenced.
When the revolution turns bloodthirsty, it's very easy to say it was his fault. And that, of course, is what those who hated him or feared him did say, and that's one of the reasons why Charlotte Corday actually murders him in 1793, because she regards him as responsible for many of the bloody atrocities that have actually occurred.
Corday makes no attempt to escape. At her trial, she is unrepentant.
What did you expect to achieve in assassinating Marat?
Peace. Now that he's dead, peace will return to my country.